Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. They say the first 30 seconds decide if you'll ever forget a story. What you're about to hear will follow you long after this video ends. Somewhere in America, hidden past crumbling bridges and roads that no GPS will map, there is a family whose name the locals still whisper with unease. No one dares speak of what happened on record. The town buries its past under layers of silence, but every now and then a stranger stumbles across the truth. That truth begins with one man. He was called many things: cursed, touched, not right in the head. He didn't ask to be born into a world where his bloodline already carried the scars of decades of isolation. Where the family tree didn't branch, it curled back inward. His body bore it all. A jaw that never grew straight, eyes that seemed to stare in two different directions, as if reality itself was splitting. And yet, he loved. He married. But here's what makes this story America's darkest secret. The woman he married wasn't just a neighbor. She wasn't just from his town. She was his own blood. The kind of union that polite society pretends could never happen in modern times. The kind of truth that leaves a scar on a place forever. This isn't a ghost story. It's worse. Because ghosts don't breathe. They don't love. They don't have children. And the real horror isn't in what this man became. It's in how everyone around him looked away. If you keep watching, you'll understand why. But be warned. Once you know, you can't unknow. They say darkness doesn't descend on a family all at once. It creeps in slowly through silence, secrecy, and choices no one wants to admit out loud. To understand how this man's life turned into a nightmare, you have to go back decades before his birth, to an isolated hollow tucked deep into the Appalachian Hills. In those hills, families didn't move in. They stayed. Roads washed out, schools closed, and churches stood half empty. But the bloodlines, they remained. This family began with hardship, like many others. Coal mines offered little pay and broke the bodies of those who worked them. Farms barely grew enough to feed their own, so neighbors married neighbors, cousins married cousins, until the very idea of looking beyond the valley felt unthinkable. They weren't evil, they were trapped. Poverty and isolation built invisible walls, and over time those walls kept everything out: doctors, outsiders, and eventually the possibility of marrying anyone beyond kin. Whispers say the first signs appeared generations ago: children born with crossed eyes, jaws that never quite aligned, or limbs shorter on one side. Some said it was God's punishment, others just looked the other way. And slowly, the family withdrew. They became the quiet ones, living at the far edge of the woods. Folks in town said they were strange, but no one offered help. By the time our man was born, the damage was already done. He entered a world where the same last name echoed back in every branch of his family tree. His mother and father were related, their parents before them too. And though no one ever wrote it down, everyone knew. He grew up with a face that drew stares and whispers, but also with a heart desperate for love, the same human longing we all share. That longing would one day lead him to someone who made him feel less alone, someone who understood him better than anyone else could. But that connection came with a price so disturbing that the town decided never to speak of it again. What they did instead was far worse. By the time he reached his teenage years, the patterns of silence surrounding his family had hardened into something unbreakable. Teachers looked the other way when he struggled. Neighbors crossed the street when they saw him coming. He wasn't dangerous. He simply carried a face and a name that reminded the town of everything it wanted to forget. The valley was full of unspoken rules, and the one that mattered most was this: you don't talk about what happens in that family. He spent most of his days wandering the dirt paths around his home, a weathered shack leaning against the tree line. Inside, the air smelled of old wood smoke and damp earth. There were no books, no photographs on the walls, no family records, just worn-out furniture and the echo of generations trapped in the same place. And yet, Despite his deformities and the whispers that followed him, he yearned for the same things any young man does: someone to understand him, someone who wouldn't look away. That someone turned out to be a girl he'd known his entire life. Her face was familiar not just because she came from the same hollow, but because their blood was the same. Their grandparents were siblings. Their families had never truly separated. To outsiders, this would sound like a horror story. To them, it felt inevitable. They began to spend time together in secret, meeting by the old creek where no one ever went. Away from the eyes of a town that judged them without offering hope, they found comfort. What started as companionship turned into something deeper, something that crossed the boundaries most of us take for granted. He wasn't capable of seeing the wrong in it. How could he, when no one had ever shown him another way? When the town eventually found out, it didn't erupt in outrage, it didn't intervene, it did what it always did: it went quiet. The same silence that had allowed this family's suffering for decades swallowed this new chapter whole. They married in secret, without legal records, and the people around them did what generations before had done. They turned away and pretended not to see. But pretending doesn't erase the consequences, it only delays them. And in this case, the consequences would echo through every dark corner of their lives. Their marriage wasn't celebrated. There were no flowers, no church bells, no smiling photographs. It happened quietly, like everything else in that family's history. A whispered vow in the presence of a handful of relatives, no official papers, no witnesses outside the hollow. In that hidden world, the rules of the outside didn't matter. What mattered was survival and the belief that love, however twisted by circumstance, could somehow make life better. For a time, they seemed happy in their own way. They shared a single-room cabin with a sagging roof, and every day followed the same rhythm: waking with the sun, tending to scraps of farmland, and disappearing into the woods when strangers came too close. Their world was small, almost suffocating, but it was the only world they knew. The whispers in town never stopped. People spoke about them behind closed doors, calling it shameful, disgusting, unnatural. But none of those people ever came to offer help or a way out. That's the dark heart of this story. It wasn't just their choices that led to tragedy, but the entire community's refusal to acknowledge what was happening right in their own backyard. When she became pregnant, the weight of their reality became impossible to ignore. The baby carried not only their love, but also the compounded genetic scars of generations. Everyone feared what that child would look like, how it would survive, or if it should survive at all. Some say the couple never once questioned keeping the baby. Others claim the family saw it as inevitable, part of the same unbroken cycle that had defined them for decades. And when the baby was born, the truth that the town had buried so long came crashing back into view. The child bore all the visible signs of the Bloodlines history, features that made people avert their eyes, whispers that spread faster than the wind through the valley. The family's already living as outcasts, sank deeper into isolation, and the silence of the community turned into something colder, avoidance so complete that it was as if they didn't exist at all. But they did exist, and the consequences of their existence would haunt not only their own lives, but the history of that town for decades to come. Because when a community buries a secret this deep, it doesn't stay buried forever. Time in that hollow moved strangely, as if the outside world barely touched it. While the rest of America roared forward into modern life, the family remained locked in its own unchanging cycle. The couple raised their child the best they could, but the signs of inherited suffering were undeniable. The baby struggled with simple milestones, its tiny body marked by the same twisted fate that had haunted the family for generations. The whispers in town grew louder, yet they were always whispers, never action. No doctor ever came, no social worker knocked on their door. The people in the valley preferred to keep the family like a ghost story, acknowledged only in hushed tones, never confronted directly. That silence wasn't kindness, it was complicity, because the truth is, the family didn't have to live this way. they were left too. As the child grew, the same patterns continued. Education was almost non-existent. Survival was the only lesson. He and his wife aged quickly under the weight of poverty and social exile. Their lives were marked by repetition, cutting wood, scavenging food, staying away from prying eyes. And yet, despite the hardship, there were moments of raw humanity that make this story even more tragic. Neighbors reported hearing laughter from their cabin on summer nights. The man adored his child. His wife sang old folk songs in a cracked but gentle voice. They weren't monsters. They were human beings trapped in circumstances no one helped them escape. But humanity isn't always enough to change fate. As the years passed, more children were born, each carrying the same marks, each deepening the whispers that swirled through town. Some families moved away entirely, saying they couldn't stand to see what that bloodline produced. Others insisted that leaving the family alone was best, even as their conditions worsened. It's easy to pretend a tragedy doesn't exist when it's hidden in the woods. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have turned away, or would you have tried to break the cycle? The answer isn't simple, because the real horror isn't just what happened to this family. It's what happens when an entire community decides silence is safer than compassion, and that silence would eventually shatter in the most unsettling way. The breaking point came slowly, like a storm building far beyond the horizon. Years of whispers and avoidance couldn't hide the truth forever. Outsiders began stumbling into the hollow, hikers, travelers, people with cameras who had heard the rumors. One by one they were drawn in by the unsettling legends of the family that time had forgotten. Some left shaken, others stayed just long enough to take photographs, as if the family were curiosities, not human beings. For the man and his wife, it felt like being hunted by shame they had never chosen. They didn't understand why strangers stared, why their faces were treated like warnings instead of evidence of a deeper failure. It wasn't a failure of their love. It wasn't even just a failure of their bloodline. It was a failure of everyone who ever knew and chose silence over mercy. As the attention grew, the Hollow's darkest history began leaking into the outside world. What had been an open secret became a documented one. Some journalists came with sympathy, others with exploitation. Either way, the damage was done. The family's pain became entertainment. The man, already burdened by a lifetime of stigma, withdrew even further. Those who saw him in his final years said his eyes carried a haunted look, as if he'd come to understand that his very existence was a story other people used to scare themselves. But what shook the town most wasn't just that the story got out. It was the realization of how many generations had been trapped. This wasn't one man making a choice. It was an inheritance of isolation, shame, and neglect. By the time anyone thought to help, the damage was so deep it could never truly be undone. The man lived and died in that hollow, never leaving the valley. His children grew up much the same way, and the same locals who whispered about him for years now shook their heads with pity, as if they hadn't been part of the silence all along. This is the point in the story where most people look away. But you're still here. And there's one more truth you need to hear before you do. It's the truth that makes this America's darkest secret, not because of what happened to him, but because of what it says about all of us. What makes this story linger long after you've heard it isn't simply the tragedy of one man or one family. It's the reflection staring back at all of us. When we talk about America's darkest secrets, we often imagine corruption in high places or unsolved crimes. But the real horror can be found in places like that hollow, where suffering was visible to everyone, and yet no one acted. It's easy to judge from a distance, to whisper about deformities or call it a curse, but the truth is far more uncomfortable. Silence is what allowed it to happen. Silence kept a man trapped. Silence let children grow up marked by generations of pain, and silence let a community pretend it wasn't their problem. The man's story isn't unique. Across history and across the world, there are families like his, hidden in forgotten corners, carrying the weight of choices and neglect they never asked for. That's why this story matters, not to exploit, not to gawk, but to remember what happens when empathy dies. He wasn't a monster. He was a human being who wanted love, who wanted to belong, and who wanted the same dignity we all crave. He died quietly, as he lived, surrounded by the woods that had kept him both safe and imprisoned. There was no headline, no obituary, no grand reckoning for the town that turned away. But the story lives on, passed through whispers until it reaches people like you, people who aren't supposed to know, people who feel the chill when they realize that this isn't just a tale about them. It's a mirror held up to all of us. Because the real question isn't how this could happen in some isolated hollow. The question is how many other tragedies like this go unseen, because it's easier to look away. It's easier to treat suffering as a ghost story than to confront what allowed it. And now that you know, you can't unknow. Thank you for watching. If you found this Sal or I important, share it. Leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. Let us know if you've ever seen a story like this in your own community, and don't forget to subscribe so these buried histories keep reaching the light. Some secrets stay hidden for generations, but tonight you've broken the silence.